Don't trip, you know? I know things is hard right now. You looking for a job. You out there hustling. Money gonna come your way, just don't trip. You gotta keep your shoes tied.
Well, there's been an awful lot of new information coming out. And I think it's time to put all of that new information into context. And if you guys remember, I was the first one to report that Suge Knight had access to a cell phone while he was in jail. And I got called by Toi and asked to take down that video, which I did out of courtesy, expecting that maybe somewhere down the road that would come back to, help me, and maybe there'd be some information that she might share with me, which never happened. But at least, I felt like I did the right thing at the time. But that doesn't stop the fact that Suge Knight girl was the one who said she was at Reggie's house when Suge called and talked to Reggie. And this was, just before his indictment, Reggie's indictment. And there was a conversation that was had between Reggie and Suge. Now, what was the topic of that conversation? I think it was, we both know a lot of information on each other, and help me help you, because I won't reveal what I know about you if you don't reveal what you know about me. And there are basically three narratives that get used in the Tupac murder. And those three narratives that drive us away from the truth, number one is Tupac is alive. Number two is Orlando Anderson was the shooter. And number three is East Coast, West Coast feud. And so when one narrative stops gaining traction, and right now the Orlando Anderson is not the shooter, is not gaining traction, they all flip to another narrative. And the narrative that's working right now is the Tupac is alive narrative. Now, let's talk about that. There are the Frank Alexander secret tapes, which revealed to us that there were people who saw the dead body. There's also the information that when Tupac died, Afeni pulled a plug because there was a number of heart attacks, and Tupac did not die of his bullet wounds. He died of kidney failure and the heart attacks. And Suge had said through Thaddeus Culpepper to Russell Poole and myself that Tupac was expected to make a recovery and he was expected to live. And it always perplexed him that Tupac did die, and he took a turn for the worst. And that actually prompted the conversation between Russell and I that Tupac was somehow finished off in the hospital. Now, there's a number of things that lead us to believe that this happened, one of which is the flaws in the death certificate, the flaws in the autopsy, the fact that the autopsy photos got leaked and they were altered, the fact that the last photo of Tupac and Suge together was released, and that also is a flawed photo, and that is what fuels the Tupac is alive theory. But there are so many people that saw the dead body, and the fact that there was an ambulance that was waiting in the cargo or the loading dock of the hospital that was idling at the time Tupac died. Now, why is there a coroner's vehicle waiting in the loading dock and idling at the time Tupac dies? They knew Tupac was going to die. He took a turn for the worst. They rushed his body over to the coroner for the autopsy, and then they rushed it over to be cremated. They talked to Afeni and they said, hey, there's going to be a DNA test and you're going to lose the estate, and they got her all worked up over that, so she agreed to cremate the body quickly. And so that also cremates any evidence of foul play in the hospital. so we can see exactly what's happening here. And let's talk about the cell phone call that was made between Suge Knight and Reggie Wright. So Reggie probably called, and this is pure speculation, but let's speculate. We've got enough information that I think we can make a very intelligent guess as to what's happened here. And if you listen to Suge, I mean, Suge basically says he expected that Tupac was going to live. Now, Frank Alexander gets called away. He comes to a meeting with Suge and Reggie. Reggie tells Frank Alexander to go along, and Frank doesn't quite go along. He says, hey, well, no, I'm going to stand up and say, hey, we got disarmed. And unless you knew that the death row entourage was disarmed, you would never roll up on a death row entourage and start shooting, because you know that death row would always shoot back. They were always armed to the teeth, and they always had cops in the entourage, according to the Beverly Hills Police. And now we know that who was not there? The cops. We had Michael Moore standing next to Reggie Wright, who heard "got him." We had somebody come across that we've been told is David Kenner, who said, don't say nothing over the radio. And then Reggie Wright reaches out to everybody else and shuts down the radio, says to everybody hey, everybody that's on this radio, shut off your radios. And they go to silence on the radios. So we know that at least one person was involved that said got him. And remember, the car that Suge and Tupac was in was still for about 90 seconds before it started moving again. So the shooters and Nate Dogg, who was following behind Frank Alexander's car, said to Daz and Badass that Tupac and Suge were dead. And so everybody did think that those 13 shots got him. And so then 90 seconds later, the car moves, and Suge says he and Tupac are laughing as they're rolling down the road, and he expected a full recovery. Now, they traveled quite some distance before they actually stopped in the opposite direction of the hospital. And I've been told by somebody who's been a longtime resident in Las Vegas and who happened to be working at Club 662 that night, that he's heard, and he still lives in Las Vegas, he's heard that the police and the ambulance personnel took Suge and Tupac on a joyride because they did not want Tupac to live. And so it was a little bit of time before Tupac got medical attention. And Reggie was insisting that Michael Moore not be in the entourage because he refused to get rid of his gun. But there's something even more telling about that. Michael Moore was somebody who was trained as a paramedic, and he would have been able to help both Suge and Tupac be patched together immediately from having been shot. He would have probably also insisted that he ride in the ambulance. And so Michael Moore would have also really complicated this Tupac assassination attempt and the Suge assassination attempt. And so we flip to now, knowing all of this information and all of this that's come out, the confession letter implicates Reggie Wright Jr. The tape at the MGM implicates Reggie Wright Sr. Many people in Compton have said, hey, that's Reggie Wright Sr. I had somebody who lived around the corner from Suge just a few days ago that I bumped into in Century City by happenstance. I showed him the picture, and he goes, man, that's Reggie Wright Sr. And he's somebody who grew up knowing Reggie Wright Sr. And so there's enough people that it's now really starting to bubble up that these guys were involved in the Orlando Anderson stage incident. They were involved in the Tupac murder. We know that there was at least 3 people that were involved because Reggie had a radio. The person that said got him had a radio. The person that said don't say nothing over the radio, which we think is Kenner, was involved in the murder. And then Reggie reaches out and says, hey, everybody that's got a radio, shut off your radio, which means that there were a lot more people that were involved. And we know that Officer Kevin Gaines from LAPD was in Las Vegas on special assignment from 2 days before the murder until 2 days after. And the confession letter and the statements by the patents tell us that Sharitha was involved, Reggie Wright Jr. was involved, and David Kenner was involved. And so we're starting to get a picture of this. That also means cops were involved, and if cops were involved, you know, Las Vegas police, Compton police, maybe other police, including Las Vegas police, were involved in the murder and the cover-up of Tupac. And so we're getting a clear picture. People saw the dead body. There's no question as to whether or not Tupac was actually murdered. And we know he was. And we think he was murdered in the hospital. And so coming back now to the call that Suge Knight made to Reggie Wright. Reggie Wright has deep ties into the sheriffs. He's the guy who was gloating less than 2 hours after Russell was dead about how Russell was dead, and he knew all of the salient details of the meeting between investigators and Russell Poole, almost like he was in the room. And we've heard from a sheriff source that he was in the room, and we have no reason to expect that the sheriffs have lied to us about that. And so Reggie Wright is now faced with a situation where he's had this beef in Tennessee, and it looks like that case against him is somehow dissipating. And we don't know for sure that that's happened, but you know, his house, the lien was lifted. His father had the ankle bracelet taken off, and so it looks like the Tennessee people are starting to, kind of waver on whether or not they're going to actually move forward with the rights. And I had reached out to the U.S. Attorney's Office and asked for clarification and asked if they were still defendants in the case, and I was answered by somebody from communications with the U.S. Attorney's Office saying no comment. Now, what's interesting about all of this, too, is that the bail amount was set at $50,000 for Reggie Wright Jr. and Reggie Wright Sr. Giles, the brother of Reggie Wright Sr., one of 18 children, puts up the bail money, and there's an interlineated waiver at the bottom that says, hey, if these guys violate the conditions of their release, you still get your money back, which means this isn't a bond, and this is a little bit out of the ordinary. And so getting back to Toi, who is Suge Knight's fiancée, and I call her Suge Knight's wife because they've been together for 11 years, and common law marriage exists in California, and so it's likely that they are common law married. But Toi, her bail is set at $2 million, not for drug trafficking and money laundering, but because she sold a tape that David Kenner gave her to TMZ, and David Kenner told her it was okay to sell that tape to TMZ. So you have David Kenner, who's early involved in the Suge Knight case and gets fired, and we learned from Tupac, who fired David Kenner, that nobody fires David Kenner without consequences. And so what do we have? Now we have consequences. The consequences of firing David Kenner have been Toi is going to jail with an indictment of having sold these tapes. And I've been told that the sheriffs listened into her conversations without a warrant to listen to those conversations, and that there are recordings of those conversations. And so we'll see where that ends up. So Reggie Wright Jr., who has strong ties into the sheriffs, smuggles a cell phone into Suge. Suge calls Toi. Toi calls Reggie and listens in on the call. And what I think was said was, hey, the only thing that's going to help me is if you flip to the Tupac is Alive story. And it's hard to prosecute somebody for a murder if the person who everybody says you murdered is still alive. And so by getting Suge to talk about how Tupac was expected to live everybody is now spinning that to the Tupac Alive theory, which I absolutely 100% do not believe. And I know there are a lot of people that believe this. There are a lot of people that hope it. We hope that we get some more music out of Tupac the genius. But Tupac was also an activist. And there's no way that activist Tupac would have stayed silent all these years. And so there's an awful lot of indications that Tupac was killed that night. And the only reason we believe anybody believes that he's alive, and I don't believe he's alive, but the reason people believe he's alive is because the autopsy is flawed, the death certificate's flawed, the photos, the leaked photo of the autopsy is flawed, the last photo is flawed, and that's all something that was factored in by a criminal defense attorney who knows how to defend against murder, and that was factored into the plan of how they were going to kill Tupac and Suge. They were probably going to do the same thing for Suge. They were going to flaw the whole thing, and it became this whole conspiracy that Tupac and Suge faked their deaths and rode off into the sunset together, and they were making music somewhere down in South America or wherever. Cuba, I think, is what everybody talks about with Tupac, because he has a relative that's in exile in Cuba. And so Reggie has that conversation, gets Toi and Suge to kind of flip, and Toi told me on the phone when she called me about the, Suge having a cell phone in prison or in jail, and said, hey, we are going to flip to a different story because we think it's in our best interest. But the truth of the matter is that Suge, with Russell Poole and myself, reached out through his attorney, Thaddeus Culpepper, and told us that the confession letter was true, that that's exactly what happened to Tupac, and it was also an attempt on Suge Knight's life, and that David Kenner had stolen $80 million from Suge Knight while he was in prison. So I hope this kind of clarifies things for everybody out there. There's an awful lot of information here, and I think it gets complicated, but it's really not that complicated. Cops were involved in the murder of Tupac. They were usually in the entourage. They were missing that night, and the cops had a deepening relationship with Sharitha, with Reggie Wright Jr., with Reggie Wright Sr., and with Snoop, because of Snoop's case. That's how it started. They started by stealing evidence in Snoop's case, and that led to an escalating pattern of behavior that eventually led to lots more evidence having been stolen out of evidence lockers, drug trafficking, stealing money from drug dealers, and eventually led to a bank robbery and Frank Laga murdering Kevin Gaines, Officer Kevin Gaines. And Officer Kevin Gaines, Rafael Perez, David Mack, and Amir Muhammad were involved in the Biggie Smalls murder. And this is all bubbling up to the top, to the surface, and the truth is powerful. It cannot be stopped. More later.
The minority to the majority. Still don't change. It's like it never will change. They won't bother. I lost a brother, but my niece, she lost her father. And how do I feel? How can I be real? Feeling this way, the way they drag down Emmett Till. It's messed up, man. My hands on the wheel. I'm still drunk driving. Road rage got me feeling like I'm out of my mind. I'm on the stage, feeling like crime, but I see these people in this place. Gotta speak the real, gotta keep it real. When I rap like this, it give me the chills. I hope you really feel what you really feel. Do what you do to make